I want to talk to you today about the second coming of Christ and what difference it makes to your Monday morning. What difference it makes to your Monday morning. We always want to read the Bible for application, being doers of the word and not hearers only. And there's a whole lot of confusion about this, as you know. One commentator I read talked about reading this book, 88 Reasons Why the Rapture Will Be in 1988. And the curious thing he said was, I bought this book in 1989. And I remember as a high school student reading this book, The Late Great Planet Earth, and I remember being convinced that I would not graduate from high school, that Christ would come before I graduated from high school. And so there's a whole lot of confusion about this. And we're going to look overview of the various views of the second coming, and then we're going to dive into this week's text. So here's the dispensational premillennial view, and we look forward to, according to this view, the rapture and the tribulation, and then the real return of Christ. We're not really looking for the return of Christ right now. We're not looking for the second coming of Christ right now. We're looking at the pre-second coming, the rapture of Christ. And then there's the 1,000-year reign, the millennium, and then there's Satan's little season, the resurrection, and then we have heaven. Slightly different take on this is historic premillennial, sometimes called post-tribulation premillennialism. And the emphasis is actually off the tribulation, but the tribulation will happen before the rapture. In any case, we're looking forward to the rapture, and then the millennium, and then Satan's little season, the resurrection, and the white throne judgment, and then heaven. Premillennialism, it seems, is held by most preachers today. Curiously, it's not held by most theologians, best I can tell. Certainly not held by most conservative theologians when I was in seminary. I think it's shifted a little more in that direction. 100 years ago, the dominant theme was postmillennialism. And this is the idea that Jesus really will answer the prayer, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And the hope is not that the world will become like heaven per se, but it will become like a real good church. It'll become a place where people follow Christ and they live according to God's ways, and the darkness will come to dawning, the dawning to noonday bright, and so on. And we will come to live in the millennial age as the gospel spreads gradually throughout the world. And then there's a dominant view held by most theologians, at least when I was in seminary, and that is amillennialism. And this holds that we are in the 1,000-year reign right now, but there's no particular emphasis on things getting better and better. Now, here's the good news. All of these views would more or less agree, and none of them completely agree with the way we're going to look at today's passage. And the key idea we want to look at today is that scholars differ on the details of the chronology, but there is no misunderstanding of the application. And as you teach today, I would encourage you to teach for application and look for what we are to do. All right, and we're going to look at all of Matthew 24, 1 through 51. And usually I read a few passages and then make one observation, two observation, three. We're just going to read straight through the whole passage, and when we get done, we'll pretty much done. But here we go. Matthew 24, beginning in verse 1. Jesus left the temple and was walking away when his disciples came up to him to call attentions to its buildings. Here's a picture of the buildings. It's actually a model. One of the ladies in my church has actually been there. She says it's quite large. I think somewhere around the range of a football field. This entire model, not just this temple, but the entire model of the city of the ancient Jerusalem. And it's not hard to see that this was a magnificent building, and the stones were pretty big. And his disciples say, "Do you see these things?" He asked. "Truly I tell you, not one stone here will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down." And I'm told that if you go to Jerusalem today, you can find these stones, and we find that this was literally fulfilled in AD 70 when Titus overthrew Jerusalem. And the passage says he went up to the Mount of Olives. So I've got a couple of pictures of the Mount of Olives. First one taken, I think, from a drone more or less above the temple mound. And then this one from the Mount of Olives itself, looking back toward the Temple Mount. But anyway, verse 3, as Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately. "Tell us," they said, and notice carefully what they ask. "Tell us," they said, "when will this happen? When will one stone not be left on top of another? And what will the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" Now, they understood this to be the same time we understand that they will be separated, as we'll talk more about in a moment. Now, one of our goals as we look at a difficult passage is to try to equip our people, to equip the saints for the work of the ministry, and to equip our people to study the Bible for themselves. And one way that we do this is encourage them just to look at a study Bible. I actually looked at this last Sunday, a week ago, and found, this is a pretty good outline for the passage. And let's see what the NIV Study Bible has to say about this. First, they say the Mount of Olives is a ridge a little more than a mile long, beyond the Kidron Valley, east of Jerusalem, and rising about 200 feet above the city. See map, and I'll show you the map in just a second. When will this happen, and what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? Jesus deals with these questions, notice carefully, but does not distinguish them sharply. However, it appears that the description of the last days, which begins with Jesus' incarnation and ends with the second coming, is presented in verses 4 through 14. So what he's saying here is verses 4 through 14 talk about the entire period between the first and second coming. This phrase, last days, in Scripture nearly always refers to this entire period. And he says verses 4 through 14 talk about this. Verses 15 through 22 talk about the destruction of Jerusalem. And verses 23 through 31 talk about Christ's coming. And I'm going to quibble on some of those verses here in just a second. As you will see, here's the map that was described. You can see the Temple Mount and then the Mount of Olives on the right side of that map. Now, I have three assumptions as I look at this passage. The first one is this. Jesus says, we'll look at a verse in just a moment. Jesus says that he does not know the day or the hour, and so he cannot possibly be answering the question of when is the day or the hour. He says he does not know. He does know some things about that day or the hour, but he does not know the when of the day or the hour. Jesus will deal with one question at a time and more or less in order. And my third assumption is this: it'll be fairly obvious when he is moved from one to another. But the NIV Study Bible says, and I agree, that this first section is talking about the entire time between the first and second coming. And Jesus answered, watch out that no one deceives you. I read one commentary that talked about there's 12 imperative verbs, something like that. I think it's 12 imperative verbs in this passage, and this is one of them. Make sure that no one deceives you, for many will come in that name during that entire period, claiming, I am the Messiah, and will deceive many. You will hear rumors and wars, but see to it that you are not alarmed. Are you ever alarmed? I tell you, there's people getting up every day trying to think about how to get you alarmed. And Jesus says, I don't want you to be alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. And just by the way, if you look at a graph of wars, the number of years that the major powers of the world were at war, it's actually getting better over the years, as this graph demonstrates. Steven Pinker says, violence has been in decline over long stretches of time, and we may be living in the most peaceful time in our species' existence. You hear that on the news every night, right? The most peaceful time in our species' existence. Nations will rise against nations, kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places, and I've heard this preached, and you probably have too. There's famines, and so Christ is coming. There's earthquakes, and so Christ is coming. And Jesus, I don't think, is saying that. He's saying this is a characteristic of this entire period of time between the first and second coming. There'll be wars, there'll be persecution, there'll be earthquakes, there'll be famines. And again, if we look at a graph, we see that things are actually getting better and better. If we look at a graph of famine, things are getting better. If you look at a graph of the global deaths from natural disasters, it's getting better and better. And Jesus said that's not a sign. All these things are the beginning of birth pains. Then you will be handed over and persecuted and put to death, and you'll be hated by all nations because of me. I've got a couple of screens on your PowerPoint that describe the persecution that is happening today. Verse 10, at that time many will turn away from the faith and will betray and hurt each other, and many false prophets will appear and deceive many. Because of the increase of wickedness, the love of most will grow cold. But the one who stands firm to the end will be saved, and the gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. And I remember reading this a week ago and thought, well, almost certainly this verse is talking about the second coming, not the destruction of Jerusalem. But as I studied it some more, I found this verse, Colossians 1:6. In the same way, the gospel is, right now he's saying, the gospel is bearing fruit and it is growing throughout the whole world. So this was clearly happening in the time before the destruction of Jerusalem. So when you see standing in the holy place, the abomination that causes desolation, spoken through the prophet Daniel, let the reader hear and understand. Now, verse 15 is where, according to the NIV Study Bible, we've shifted from things that happened between the first and second coming. Now we're looking at things that happened just before the destruction of Jerusalem. Just by the way, I noticed the Holman Christian Standard Bible labels this section the Great Tribulation. And when I think of the Great Tribulation, I think of that period of time just before the second coming, according to dispensationalists, or just before the rapture. And because of that, I don't think this is the best heading. As I say, the NIV Study Bible says that this section here is talking about things that happened just before the destruction of Jerusalem. But the key thing is, I want you to notice that those headings are not actually in the text of Scripture itself. So when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation spoken through the prophet Daniel, let the reader hear and understand. Now, this is from the Life Application Study Bible. What was the abomination that causes desolation mentioned by both Daniel and Jesus? Rather than one specific object, event, or person, it could be seen as any deliberate attempt to mock and deny the reality of God's presence. Daniel's prediction came true in 168 BC, when Antiochus Epiphanes sacrificed a pig to Zeus on the sacred temple. Jesus' words were remembered in AD 70 when Titus placed an idol on the site of the burned temple after destroying Jerusalem. In the end times, the Antichrist will set up an image of himself and order everyone to worship it. These are all abominations that mock God. Verse 16, then let all those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let no one on the housetop go down to take anything out of the house. Now, this was almost certainly talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. It seems to me it doesn't make any sense in any other context, but in the destruction of Jerusalem, it is. And I'm told that 1 million Jews were killed during this time, but almost no Christians, because they followed what Jesus said here. You see, the normal thing would have been when an enemy army is coming to run to the city, because the city had walls, and particularly in the case of Jerusalem, those walls are on top of a mountain. So he had to kind of climb up a bit of a mountain and then scale these walls to get in, and it would have seemed safer to get inside. And Jesus said, don't do that. Go flee to the hills. And many Christians did that and were in fact saved. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let no one on the housetop go down and take anything out of the house. Get out of here quickly, he's saying. Let no one in the field go back and get their coat, saying more or less the same thing. How dreadful it will be in those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers. Will it be dreadful for pregnant women and nursing mothers when Jesus returns? No, this is talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. Pray that your flight will not take place in winter or on the Sabbath. They had limitations about how far they could travel on the Sabbath. So he says, pray it doesn't happen on the Sabbath. For then there will be great distress, unequaled from the beginning of the world until now, and never to be equaled again. And I think this is saying that all people are loved by God, but God does have a special people, and it's not me and it's not you, at least unless you're Jewish. It's not you. It's God's chosen people, the Jewish people, and his favorite city is not Atlanta or Boston. It's the city of Jerusalem. And he's saying that when Jerusalem is destroyed, that is as bad as it gets. Verse 22, if those days had not been cut short, no one would survive, but for the sake of the elect, those days will be shortened. Notice, going back to the NIV Study Bible, verse 23, they think describes now the second coming. I'm going to argue it starts a few verses later, but anyway, verse 23. At that time, if anyone says to you, look, here is the Messiah, or there he is, do not believe it. For false messiahs and false prophets will appear and perform great signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the elect. See, I've told you ahead of time. So if anyone tells you, there he is out in the wilderness, do not go out. Or here he is in the inner rooms, do not believe it. For as the lightning comes from the east and is visible even in the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Now, what is that talking about? Is that talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, or is that talking about the second coming? Well, it seems to me it is almost certainly talking about the second coming. So will be the coming of the Son of Man. And what does he tell us about the second coming? That'll be sudden, that'll be visible. It's like when this whole sky fills up with lightning. You don't have to say to someone, hey, did you see that? It's not like a shooting star that you might say, hey, did you see that up there? The whole sky will fill with lightning. And he gives another analogy in verse 28, where he says, where there is a carcass, the vultures will gather. And what he's saying here is, from the viewpoint of the vultures, the carcass is completely visible. And he's saying that's how the coming of the Son of Man will be. That's how the second coming will be. It will be completely visible. Immediately after the distress of those days, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light. Now, I think this is the most difficult verse in the whole passage. And the first question is, after the distress of those days. What is that talking about? Well, I think he's gone back to talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, and he says immediately after the distress of those days, then the sun will be darkened, and so on. Well, that immediately verse, I've read a number of commentaries that agree with me on this, that is the most difficult word in the most difficult verse in this passage. So let's look at what this means. Look first at what I call a vertical word study. We go down in the Greek and we see that usually this word immediately. It means quickly, it means right away, at that moment, and so on. But not always. We do have one case where it's translated, I hope to see you soon. So let's look at a Greek dictionary, and we see that it means a point of time immediately subsequent to a previous point of time. The actual interval of time differs appreciably depending on the nature of the events, and so on. This commentary said the analogy of the mountain range is often used to explain this concept. If you stood on a mountaintop staring across another mountaintop, it might appear that the peaks are close to each other when in fact they are miles apart. You see a picture here, and you can see the difference between these mountain ranges because of the haze that is in the foreground. If the haze were gone, it might look like one mountain range, but in fact there is a gap between those, and that's what this writer is saying that this word means. Likewise, Jesus spoke of two mountains, AD 70 being one mountain and the Perusia being the other, as if they were close together, when in reality they are thousands of years apart. Then will appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then all the people on earth will mourn when they see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And this passage here reminds us of 1 Thessalonians, and he will send his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. Now learn this lesson from the fig tree. As soon as its twigs get tender and its leaves come out, you know that summer is near. Even so, when you see all these things, you know that it is near, right at the door. Truly I tell you, this generation will certainly not happen until all these things have happened. Now, what's that talking about? Well, it seems to me it is almost certainly talking about, again, the destruction of Jerusalem. That Jerusalem will be destroyed in the lifetime of the people who are standing here. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. Notice verse 36. But about that day or hour, no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. And Jesus is saying he does not know when he will come back. And if someone tells you they know when he will come back, they are just wrong. As it was in the day of Noah, so it will be in the days of the coming of the Son of Man. And the idea here is that people were just going about their business. For in the days before the flood, people were eating, drinking, and marrying, and giving in marriage, up until the day Noah entered the ark. And they knew nothing about what would happen until the flood came and took them all away. It came along suddenly. They didn't know it was coming, and that's how the coming of Christ will be. This is how it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. 2 men will be in the field, one will be taken, the other left. 2 women will be grinding at the hand mill, one will be taken, the other left. Therefore, keep watch. Again, look at the application. What are we to do? We are to not be alarmed. We are not to be deceived. We are to keep watch. We are to be ready. That's the key thing, the application. Teach for application. Don't get caught up in the details of it. Teach for application. Keep watch, because you do not know on what day the Lord will come. But understand this, if the owner of the house had known at what time at night the thief was coming, he would have kept watch, and he would have not have his house broken into. So you must also be ready. What's the application? Be ready. Don't get alarmed, because the Son of Man will come in an hour when you do not expect him. Let me skip down to verse 48. But suppose that servant is wicked and says, my master is staying away a long time. What does that tell us? It tells us there will come a day when people will say, well, Christ isn't coming because he hadn't come for a long time. Clearly indicating that there will be a gap between the destruction of Jerusalem and when Jesus' final coming will be. Well, what have we learned? The second coming will be visible, it will be obvious, it will be sudden, and we need to be ready, and we need to not be alarmed, and we need to not be deceived, and that is the application. And may God richly bless you as you teach your people to be ready for the second coming at any time.